Thank you very much. And also my turn to thanks to the organizer for this wonderful 2-day conference. And yeah, exactly. My paper today will present the corpus of astrological gem, then focusing on some examples of this kind of gemstones that can be used on magical practices. But before going deep in the subject, I was just briefly recall the link between astrology and magic. Of course, they are well known already. Franz Cumont defined magic as the twin sister of astrology, before then adapting the Fraser paradigm and linking astrology more with astral religion. But of course, this link between astrology and magic, it's also already present in our sources. For example, Pliny in the Natural History is one of the first that talk about this mistrust, who links astrology, that he called artes mathematicas, with magic, and it's also frequent on Roman law. For example, I quote here a more later law, the Codice Theodosiano, that puts a magician and astrologer on the same plane. They say that the Chaldeans, magician, and all other whom ordinary men call evil. So, but what is interesting to me is to understand for what can astrology be useful in magical practices. So, first of all, one main point is that astrology allows to elaborate a new kind of cosmology that will be proper to the ritual operator, and where Ursa Major plays a crucial role. I just put here one of the example in the Greek magical papyri, because Ursa Major is always called upon some magical practices. For example, here I invoke the great power in the heavens under the command of the Lord God to turn the sacred pole with the mighty hand. And it is this part, to turn the sacred pole, that explain the role that Ursa Major play in magic, because it is one of these circumpolar constellation that never go down to the ocean if you use the Greek way. So it's always visible in the sky, and this linked to the fact that is the power that allow the stars, the planets, the constellation to move. So it's the power that move all the cosmos. And for example, it's not surprising that on the astrological table, for example, in the Tabula Bianchini, but also in other example, it is represented at the center of the zodiacal ring. So it is the one of the role of astrology in magical practices is to creating a kind of cosmology where the magician is put himself, and he can appeal with prayer this kind of astral power in order to begin the ritual. But the most important role of astrology is the fact that is establish the right timing for the ritual act. So Michael already presented one of these so-called moon circle, and this is another one that is quite interesting. We will see soon why, and it is similar to the one that we just saw, because it begins as the moon and then he gives the position of the moon in the different zodiacal sign, and then what ritual you will do. For example, lecanomancy in Cancer, or spell of attraction in Sagittarius. And in the way that this ritual function is basically on some kind of sympathy. For example, the fact that divination linked with water is associated with Cancer is based on the animal itself. Or for Sagittarius, is because it's a sign that is linked with fire, so it is associated with erotic magic. So one role of astrology in magical practices is to dictate the time for doing a ritual. And then the other role is the one that astrology is used to vivifying the materia magica. And this is clear, especially on some practices that need the consecration of engraved gems or of a ring, like the passage here, where we see the description of the presence again of the moon in a particular zodiacal constellation that are good in order to consecrate a ring to activate its power. Then, of course, this kind of influence of astrology is linked with the concept of aporrhoia, meaning on emanation. So aporrhoia is this concept that explains how the celestial world interact with Earth. And this is also extremely present on some stones, on name of some stones. For example, Afroselenos, that literally mean the moon foam. So we have this kind of materiality that show this emanation that come from the sky to Earth. And it's really clear, for example, in the passage of Artemidoros that call, for example, the morning dew, the blood of the star. Then the act to expose some material like a gem or some preparation, some materia magica to the star is also already present in the Mesopotamian tradition, where normally when they prepare some kind of medicine or even some kind of magical amulets, they expose it to the light of the star Capella because it was linked to the goddess of medicine Gula. So here we see that this presence of astrology in order to consecrate or amulets or magical practices is already established in the Mesopotamian tradition. One example that is particularly interesting, and I just found it when I was preparing this conference, is this magical gem. It's an orange carnelian, and normally Erika Zwirlein-Diel dated it towards the first half of the 2nd century CE, but of course this with a discussion with Arpad, it's clear that it can be post-antique. But and this is one of the main problem when we study, for example, astrological gemstones, because they were extremely popular during the Renaissance and so on. And so we have a lot of new creation type, but they are quite also interesting to study them. Why in this case? So the representation show the classical, no, first of all, why we can consider it post-antique. And in that case is the presence here of the centaur with an arc, so representing the constellation Sagittarius. And Sagittarius is extremely rare on engraved gemstones. And the only case that we have of a gem that we are sure that this is antique is this agate kept in New York that is dated to the 2nd century BCE. Sorry, it is an error here. And it is an italic production. Because all the other representation of Sagittarius are post-antique, as in this case on this lapis lazuli that you can see that already the pose that the archer has is a little bit strange for the antique engraved technique. So it is quite easy to conclude that it's also part of a post-antique production. So the presence of Sagittarius normally is already a good element to consider a gem as post-antique. But what is interesting here is that we have on this gem a representation of Aphrodite Anadyomene that we know is linked with erotic magic, and we have a lot of magical gem that representing the description that it can be used in love magic. And I have shown before this moon circle where we have seen that the production of a spell of attraction, so on erotic magic, must be done in the Sagittarius constellation. So this is a really interesting case where if this piece is, if it is post-antique, the engraver inspired from probably text that could have described a similar procedure. And this is quite clear with the presence of Aphrodite and the presence of Sagittarian and the text on the moon circle. This is what just one of the last examples that I was working on. But now, more generally, why it is interest to study astrological gem. When I was finishing in 2021 my PhD, I read 2 years after an interesting article of Perea Yebenes that claim that astrological gems have been poorly studied, and it is understandable. Many of them show 1, 2, or 3 symbols that by themselves mean little. This is an interesting take on this kind of material, and then it speaks about a magical use of the zodiacal conjunction of Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricornus. And here it is really interesting because, of course, when you are 3 symbols, they can mean little, but sometimes you can also take it for what they are not. Because in fact, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricornus are not related to a magical use at all, but it's what Maria spoke yesterday about the Thema Mundi. And this is a Roman interpretation of the Thema Mundi. You see 3 of the cardinal points of the birth chart. So Aries, Capricornus, and Cancer, and then the little head of Octavian, so the future Emperor Augustus. And this is clearly a political propaganda gem, because on showing the Thema Mundi, so the horoscope of the world, is announcing a new beginning of a new era that will begin with the Principate. And of course, it is a really political use that is often present on astrological gemstones. Then a little bit of historiography. The first one to study astrological gems was the Italian antiquary Anton Francesco Gori, that published in 1750 a Thesaurus Gemmarum Antiquarum Astriferarum, where he gave the first catalog of 220 gems that are part of the Lorenzo de' Medici collection, and that they depict strictly astrological symbols or astrological representation. And it is interesting because most part of this collection is also post-antique. For example, this is one of the plates that Gori described in the catalog, and the same is kept in Firenze in the Museo Archeologico Nazionale. And I was also interested on how he was studying this kind of material, and it is kind of striking the fact that he already tried to provide some explanation for the presence of certain zodiacal signs in these gems. For example, speaking of the Florence example, he say, astrologers divide the 12 signs into 4 trigons. They regard Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces as belonging to the phlegmatic and to the water element. These signs influence navigators, fishermen, and swimmers, whose interest and dedication revolve mainly around things related to water. So it's not simply giving a catalog of this collection of astrological gems in the Lorenzo de' Medici, but it's also providing an explanation that it's based on his knowledge of astrology at the time. And it's not surprising that he sometimes already quote Manilius, so the main Latin poet that is speaking on astrology, the main astrologer poet, as it is called. Then why using astrological gems? Of course, as in the case of magical gems, it is a modern term that I use to identify a particular group of intaglios, because it never appeared on ancient sources. And already in the lapidary tradition, there is only one lapidary that is clearly astrological, because he begins with Damigeron Evax, so 2nd century CE, and it begins with the stone are related to the 7 signs. The first stone, chrysolite, is the stone of Leo, and then you go on. And you can already see that it's mentioning 7 signs, because these are not strictly zodiacal stones, but more planetary stones. And it's mentioning the sign that is the domicile of the planet to link the stone with the planet itself. I give here some example, chrysolite and Leo, because Leo is the domicile of Leo is Helios, and sometimes we have representation of these planets in their domicile, as you can see in this green jasper, where Helios stands on the top of the lion. So this is the only lapidary that is clearly speaking about astrology, but I can also say in 2 words that, of course, normally in the other lapidary, or even in other magical treatises as the Quranides, astrology is present, but it's not directly mentioned. That means that we can decipher the presence of astrology, in this kind of treatises, looking at the materia, magica or medica, that it used, because this use is based on the Neoplatonist cosmic chains, for which each planet is linked with a series of metals, of stones, of animals, based on mythological links, etc. So it's possible to pinpoint some astrological influence also in the treatises where astrology is not directly present. So I must also mention from an historical point of view that we have only 2 studies on astrological gems, and there are 2 articles, one of Maria Grazia Lancellotti, Gemme e Astrologia, and one from Simon Mitchell von Dungen, Studies on Magical Amulets. And it was, I was kind of struck by the fact that they are 2 articles that are published in a publication linked with magic. So the first interest on studying astrological gemstones was linked with magical gems, at least at the beginning. And it's also, there are some strong claims by Simon Mitchell that say gems with images of other signs like Pisces, Gemini, Virgo, and so forth have never been found. But in fact, if we approach a more, if we determine some characteristics that can help us identifying the signs, in fact, all 12 are present. Now I will go quickly an overview of the 5 criteria that I was using for identifying astrological gem. Well, of course, the first criteria is the most simple one, the presence of asterism. So, for example, it's quite simple. When a star appears beside, for example, an animal, it's probable that what we want to represent is not the animal itself, but its astral counterpart, so the constellation. But this is not enough, because sometimes, as we have seen, astrology is linked with magical procedures when dictate the time. And so some asterisks also appear on other kind of gems that cannot be defined as astrological, because the motif in itself, it's not astrological. And the example is the very famous series of gems with the lizard that are used for ophthalmic problems. And the ritual that describe the preparation of the gems specify care must also be taken to take the lizard and prepare the remedy as follows during the old moon, from the 19th to the 25th day of the moon. So in this case, it's clearly that the moon open to bottom is just there to a mnemonic device to make a reference to the ritual itself. So the gem cannot be defined as astrological. Then, of course, the more sure element are the inscription, and especially inscription related to what I talking names, meaning that they are names that were chosen to link the name of the child to the moment where the child was born. And in this case of the red jasper, you can see there is the presence of a lion, and then the inscription Chrysogon. So the name could be Chrysogonos, so born from gold, and lion is linked with gold in the astrology tradition. So here even if there are no asterisks, we have the inscription that could indicate that we can consider it an astrological intaglio. And the same here with this Aries jumping to the right with the inscription, this time in Latin, primus. Oh, here it's a little bit more complicated because, of course, as we know, Aries is also the first sign of the zodiac, but it can also be a pun made on like the fact that it is the first sign of the zodiac and that the child was born under Aries, so they call it primus. Then we have also magical inscription that can help us define astrological gemstones. For example, of course, Abrasax, that we know that the name encapsulates, so from a psephomancy point of view, the number 365. So when it is linked with the image of Aries jumping and with a star and a moon, the name Abrasax and the reference to the years clearly underline the astrological value of the gem. And I just put these images because one of the principles of the composition of astrological images used by Simon Mitchell to identify astrological gemstones in the case of Aries was the fact that it's turning the head. And this is something that we know from astrological treatises because Aries normally look where the constellation of Taurus is. But on gemstones, and especially on animal, the fact that it's turning the head, it's also quite kind of typical of other animal representation, like in this case with the panther. So it is interesting to see that also this iconographical detail that was used by Simon von Dunger by itself cannot be generalized to identify a constellation of Aries on gemstones. Then the third criteria are astrological and mythographical sources that can give some hints about the motif that is represented. It is especially the case with the rudder. Here we can see again Aries jumping toward the left with a caduceus and is representing on the top of a rudder. And the rudder in the astrological tradition have an important meaning because it's always linked with the horoscope. Here I quote passages from the astrologer Thrasyllus that say horoscope is the rudder relating to fortune, soul, and lifestyle, etc. So the rudder can be the symbolic representation of the ascendant, so of the sign of birth. Then we have also the iconographic syncretism, especially with the Egyptian tradition. And this is quite clear on this kind of strange representation. To the left, you can see this mix between a crab and a scarab. So the part that are a reference of the scarab are on the abdomen, and the two little pincers are a reference to the crab. Or sometimes they are not connected, but one side of the gems, as on the top, represent the scarab, and the other side a Cancer. And this could be linked with what we know as the dodecauros. That means the 12 shapes that the sun take during the day, and they are linked in the magical papyri with a zodiacal sign. And if we look, for example, towards Cancer, we see that it's the scarab that is linked with Cancer. And we have really few examples of representation. One is the zodiac d'Areci, and I thank Joachim for sending me picture because the zodiac d'Areci for a long time was only known by a very bad scan, but Joachim managed to find it in the IFAO archive, where we have at the center Helios and the moon, and then the dodecauros and the 12 zodiacal signs. Then the fifth criteria is the development of new iconographical schemes. This is especially necessary for zodiacal signs that have already many links with astral myths, because you know each constellation is linked with a particular myth that explain why it is present in the sky, and some are very rich, like the zodiacal sign of Virgo, that it's linked normally with decades, or with the representation of justice, that we have a lot of example on what we can call ordinary ecliptic, as here holding the cornucopia and holding the scales. So there was a need to develop a new image. And for Virgo, it's particularly interesting because there is also a change of sex in the series of Emperor Antoninus Pius. It's a zodiacal series where the emperor represents the 12 zodiacal signs and the domicile, etc. Virgo is represented as Mercury cutting some ear of grain. And this is also known on normal gems, as you can see on this red carnelian. But the description in the catalog of Giovanni Dattari precise that this representation is the representation of the domicile of Virgo, so Mercury, in the signs. And that explains why the signs is represented as a man in that case. It was a little bit difficult to prove that this could be a representation of Virgo, but then I stumbled on a little plasma kept in Hanover that make the link, because sadly it's bad preserved, but it's a female figure cutting some ear of grain and with a pair of wings, and it is a wing Artemis, and given the fact that Artemis is the Parthenos by excellence, it could be a first representation of the transformation of the signs. And then another element that can prove that this could be the case is that we know that Virgo in zodiacal Melothesia is linked with the hips, also with the uterus, because Manilius used the Latin word of ilia that can embrace a little bit of, it's broader than just the hips. And then we have this series of magical gems that are very well known with the cutter of grain, and they are for the hips, so ischion. But this normally is linked with Saturn, hematite, etc. I will not go on details, but it seems also possible that in that case we have an influence from zodiacal Melothesia, in the fact, if we consider the one cutting ear of grain as the representation of the zodiacal sign Virgo. Then I will conclude this first part with the importance of materiality. I just choose an example for the zodiacal sign of Cancer. And it's interesting that on 32 intaglios that represent the zodiacal sign, 17 are jasper. And in a much later treatise, the Planetarum Gemmis, that give a series of stones for each planet, the stone of the planet Jupiter is jasper, and of course Jupiter is his exaltation in the zodiacal sign of Cancer. So using this particular stone for engraving the zodiacal sign itself is linked it with his exaltation, meaning the planet Jupiter. Then I will just go quickly through the classification, because then we will move a little bit further with some example of use of astrological gems in magic. So of course, we have the representation of all the zodiacal ring, of all the 12 zodiacal signs. I will not go in detail, we just show. I just go in detail with Scorpio, Libra, because Libra, we also say yesterday, it's a little bit peculiar, because normally in the Greek word, Libra is represented with the Kali of Scorpio. And for example, in the little metropolis in Athens, this is a very poor photo of mine, but Libra is represented by the claws of Scorpio, and also on this carnelian kept in Copenhagen, you can see here two claws that can be the representation of the constellation, because we know that it is represented as such in the Greek word. Of course, this changed with the Roman word, because it is only on Roman times that Libra became the sign linked with scales. And the first attestation is, of course, Varro, that say they call them signs because they signify something like Libra, which indicate the equinox. And then the change from the Clovos Scorpion towards the representation of the scales is especially present during the reign of Augustus. It's still linked with his political and propaganda program. Then we have some constellation and single stars, even if probably the constellations are not antique. We have the Hyades, that is an unicum, this female figure on top of a road, I don't have the words in mind, but what can I say? The Rue de Char. Yeah, on the top of a wheel, thank you, Arpad, and pointing toward the 7 stars. Then one of the stars is Serpentarius, but this could also be linked with a post-antique production because Serpentarius was used, especially from medieval times, against the pestilence, the Black Pest. And then Sirius, that is always represent as the bust of a dog with some solar rays and a flame that come out of his mouth. Then we have the planets. Here we can go a little bit faster. Then we have the representation of horoscopes and moon crescents with or without stars. But now focus a little bit on horoscope because this is one of the cases where there is a very probable magical use. So we have not so many gems that represent an horoscope, but the few that we have are quite precise. In fact, you can see in this Nicolo that is kept in Paris, and well, the date, we can debate on that because the date is based on the astrological position of planets in zodiacal signs. So this is the date of the one commissioning the stone. So that doesn't mean that the stone was engraved in 215 AD. And you can see that you have the bust of the planet on top of each zodiacal sign that is part of his birth chart, with Greek letter indicated the degrees where the planet was found at the moment of birth. This is one of the few that are really precise. We have another example that is just a representation of the bust on top of a particular zodiacal sign. You don't see very well on the screen, but you have, for example, Mars and Venus on Libra, Saturn on Capricorn. So this is another variant that is a little bit not so precise as the previous one. We have also a beautiful gold ring that is similar to the gemstones, where in this case, there is the inscription representing each planet in each zodiacal sign. And then why is this interesting from a magical point of view? So I was trying to see what the texts are telling us about the importance of knowing his personal birth chart. And there is an interesting debate between Iamblichus and Porphyry about the daimon. And this is the response of Iamblichus to Porphyry. So we are in a really Neo-Platonic milieu. And there is an interesting passage because you can see, you say, in fact, that it is well known that he is surely happy who, having learned the celestial configuration of his own birth, was able to deflect the effect of fatality by a sacrifice for having known his personal demon. And here, having learned the celestial configuration seems quite interesting. We will see with parallel of other texts, because it seems that if you know your own birth chart, you can enable a change on your own destiny. And this is more clearly on another, it's a very complicated passage in the Greek magical papyri, because there are 2 versions of this ritual, but here I give you the most interesting part. You begin with, you then ask, Master, what is fated for me? And he will tell you even about your star and what kind of diamond you have, and your horoscope, and where you may live and where you will die. And if you hear something bad, do not cry out or weep, but ask that he may wash it off or circumvent it, for this God can do everything. So again, for me, the important part is that we have in this case the mention of the horoscope linked with a ritual that aims primarily to change your own fate. And another passage in a papyrus of Berlin is similar to what we have seen, even if in that case the practice is different, because in this case it's just to transfer a disease from a client to another based on the fact that both have the same similar birth chart, as you can see, Koinen Sunastrian. And when I was working on this material, I was also looking at the life in Plutarch, and a particular passage was striking in the life of Caius Marius. You can see that he say, this man, Sylla, then, before Marius entered the city, was dragged down from the rostra by men who had been sent on before and butchered. And we are told that a Chaldean chart, the diagramma Chaldaicon, was found in his bosom after he had been slain. And I was asking, in fact, myself, if this reference to a diagramma Chaldaicon could be a reference to the personal horoscope that Sylla had on himself, probably on a piece of papyrus, for example, on a phylacterion, in order to protect him, but he didn't work. And this is interesting because Plutarch is also making, criticizing one that it's using some foreign practices compared to Marius, that it's the one that is more related to the real Roman practices. But there are still discussion because the word diagramma, it's never used in astrology to define a birth chart. So this is still up to interpretation. But what I wanted to show in these first examples, from my point of view, it's possible that the fact that some birth charts were engraved on gemstones is just to attract luck and to a mean to control his own destiny, especially because the 2nd and 3rd century, we know that there was also this current of fatalism or astral fatalism where you cannot change your fate. So this can be a mean to escape what the planets have established at the moment of birth. Then I have still some time for another case studies that it's kind of interesting because it was first seen as a interpretatio Egyptiaca by Attilio Mastrocinque, but we can also propose a astrological meaning. And it is, this is also, sorry, a last example of a magical gem with an horoscope, or what we can presuppose it is an horoscope. You have in the center a big scorpion, then the head of Aries, Taurus, and Libra. But it's a particular gem, and you have also a sort of chrism on the back, but it is interesting the inscription that say, stay away from injustice and fear will not come near you. It is an interesting piece that can reinforce this kind of interpretation. Then this is the series that I'm also interested on. It always represents the lion with the head of a bull. And the head of a bull can be represented in the month of the lion, as in the yellow jasper here, or under the right paw of lion. And of course, there is always the presence of an asterisk. And the first to comment on that was Attilio Mastrocinque, based on this chalcedony that was once part of the Heinrich Seyrig collection, because there is also an interesting magical inscription that say, I'm holding you and I have got you. And for Attilio Mastrocinque, this is something that could be related to Egyptian world, because the lion for him is the representation of Horus, and the head of the bull of Set, because we know, and Joachim already pointed out yesterday, that normally the leg of the bull is a representation of the Big Dipper that is linked with Set, and especially on Dendera, we have the hippopotamus deity that is holding because so it cannot create chaos in the cosmos. And it's something that this association between the Big Dipper, Set, we also have in Plutarch the Isidie and Osiride, you can see, in that of Typhon, the bear, and sometimes even in the Greek magical papyrus, where Tauriata is used to define the Big Dipper, so meaning a Taurian theriomorph figure, so also a reference probably to Set. So for Attilio Mastro 5, it's just a representation of Horus dominating Set, so a representation of the control of bad power. What is interesting is that he claimed that it's not useful to study the star of the zodiac because the head of Taurus cannot represent the zodiacal sign of Taurus. This is clearly right when we are speaking about the zodiacal ring with the 12 sign, but it's not right when we are looking at astrological material like globe used to represent the real constellation, because in fact, Taurus is one of these kind of constellation that appear in the sky just with the head. You can see I've put 3 globes, and we just look at the globe of Mainz, for example, you see the protome of Taurus, and also Manilius especially explain that these are what we call mutilate signs. In the passage on Astronomy, I say, now if you examine all the signs with keen attention, you will find some bereft of limbs, which are lost. So, and also Aratos point this out when he say, look for the hornet bull, which is lying there. The signs for recognizing him are very clear. See how clearly its head stands out. But on gemstones, we have really few representation of what I think it is the constellation of Taurus with just the protome, especially on gems that are linked with the legionary world, because I will not go in detail, but each legion is linked with a zodiacal signs that is linked with the moment when the legion was created. Then to wrap up a little what it's my interpretation, if we took an astrological interpretation, we can propose to see here the fight between Lion, that is representing summer, and Taurus, that is linked with spring. So it's like a cosmic fight. And it's something that we find in Seneca, for example, when he say, behold, my first work, the lion occupies the sky, lighting up, boiling with anger, and preparing to bite. He's going to devour a star, he rises huge and menacing, opening his huge mouth, breathing fire and shaking his sparkling mane. In a single leap, he will leap over the heavy autumn, over the icy winter, and fall back into spring, breaking the neck of the Taurus, Tauricolla. So, what I propose in this particular series of gems is the following. In my opinion, it is probable that the astral struggle between Leo and Taurus evokes the dominant position of Leo in the sky against Taurus, the symbol of spring. In this way, the episode recalls the transition from spring to summer associated with the regeneration of nature, so it is simply an image of the solar renewal of the world. I still take one just final minute to present something that Harpad sent me a long time ago when you were in the Liverpool Museum. And I don't know if you see the image very well, but it's a really complicated gems. And I think, we think both that it could probably post-antique. But what is interesting is that it could represent at least the main figure, a version of the third decan of Capricorn, and I want to know the opinion of Joachim on that, because it represents a variant of the Acephalos with the 7 snake. But then the body of the figure is strange because it is the body of a satyr. But satyr is mentioned in a fragment of Antiochus of Athens explaining one of the Paranatelonta. He say, of a satyr who hide his head. and hiding his head could point toward an acephalus. So here we have a Satyresque acephalus linked with Capricorn, and also the constellations that are represented around the main figure are some paranatelonta of this sign. For example, you can see this syntagma with Corvus that is standing on a man. Then on the outer rim of the gem, we have 3 zodiacal signs, Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, and then this strange figure that repeat Corvus with a man, Capricorn, and then what can be Ketos, and then a snake. But this was just out of curiosity to show an example of what I'm trying to disentangle this figure, but it's clearly that it's something that pointing towards a post-antique creation. But thank you very much anyway for your attention.
Thank you, Fabio, for that absolutely fascinating paper, and so rich, and the iconography is just so interesting and complicated. I wanted to ask you about the figure of the grain cutter.
Sorry,
the figure of the grain cutter, and where he comes from.
Of the grain?
The grain cutter.
Okay, the grain cutter. Okay.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that it seems to be it seems to cross genders and roles as well. So we have divinities cutting the grain, Hermes, Artemis, and we also have the figure of someone who looks like a hunched peasant making good progress through a field. I wondered whether it might have some connection, possibly tangential connection to the Eleusinian mysteries, but
yeah. I see. But this it's not. I mean, it's not impossible because it is an Alexandrian mind thing, the one of Antoninus Pius. So I must admit that I didn't cross these paths in the interpretation because I was starting from the one that Datteri describes, so I was more focusing on that. But it's also interesting that even on a Roman zodiac, sometimes in only two occasions, Virgo is represented not as a female but as a male person.
Wow.
And then, yes, the fact, cutting grain is also linked with the fact that Virgo, in the divine Menothesia of Manilius, is linked with Demeter, so with the divinity linked with the grain, etc., etc. But I will looking up because I didn't think about a possible influence.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea, and if it did, it would be a huge breach of Eleusinian conventions about revealing the content of the ritual. But it just fascinates me iconographically, because it's so rare to find these images of people engaged in work tasks.
Yeah, and it's interesting that on gems there is an explosion of this representation at the moment that the series of Antoninus Pius is minted, because they start to be more present from the 2nd century CE on. But before, we have a very few representation.
Questions?
Thank you. So thank you, Fabio. It was really fascinating. I have 2 concrete and 2 general questions. May I begin with the concrete ones? The first question is related to the Hanover gem Peter mentioned. I wonder if you know any other example of any other representation of Artemis with wings, because for me it's totally unknown, and perhaps we will discuss it later on. I'm not sure that it belongs to this astrological type. The second one is a simple question. You mentioned this. It was a red jasper, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, a red jasper gem with the lion and the name Chrysogonon. Why isn't the name in accusative, in the accusative?
Yeah.
So, and later on.
So for those of you who didn't hear Arpad's questions, the first one related to the gem which showed Artemis, and he asked whether Fabio knew of any other gems that show Artemis with wings, and raised a question, more general question, I guess, about whether this is in fact related to the astrological theme, and the other one related to the the red jasper gem with a lion. And the legend, the name Chrysogonos, and why Chrysogonon, sorry, and why the name is in the accusative. Thank you.
No, thank you, Arpad, for both questions. Artemis with wings and a link to Virgo. There is just one example on a zodiac that I can show you later on. But yes, it's a little bit puzzling, as you said, because it's not a normal convention in the representation, in the normal representation. For the accusative is, I don't actually, I was expecting a genitive, for example. And of course, the fact that it is an accusative, I don't have an answer yet. I ask also Aubry.
Well, I mean, is it a case at all? I mean, what we have here is the stem of the noun Chrysogon,
yes,
and no ending. So I mean, basically, we can put it into whatever ending we want, can't we?
Ah, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I made a mistake.
Yeah, this was because
only Chrysogon, and
yeah,
it goes on. Yeah, that is it's broken. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
no, but because
Okay.
it's
So it originally would have had an ending.
yeah.
So,
but the interpretation in the catalog is that there were no letter after. So the catalog is considering it as an accusative. But because they think that they will not be had other letter after.
okay.
Because it's cheap. Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah. It's a bit of a legend.
Yeah.
A dot.
So my third question is statistical.
Yes.
As I've learned from you, we have approximately 200 astrological gems, and it doesn't work. It's a little bit. Is it okay? Sorry. As I learned from you, I've learned from you, we have approximately 200 astrological gems. And we have, as far as I know, more than 4,000 ancient magical gems, between 4,000 and 4,500. How to explain this huge difference? Why we have how to explain this huge gap between the two categories?
No, yes, thank you. Yeah, it's mostly because very few zodiacal signs are represented on magical gemstones. I mean, the stars that always, the main zodiacal signs that it represented is lion. And then we have, of course, all the representation with the moon and the stars, but of the sign itself, there are few, because the lion is the main principle that is there, with the little series with the lion and Eros, lion with the protome, because it's the only one that is charged with an important meaning that is linked with the sun. Then we have the representation of the zodiacal the zodiacal ring, but there we have also in the limit between magical, non-magical, and these are like around 70 gems, and these enter in this same explanation as the fight between the lion and Taurus with the cyclical renewal, because basically astrological magical gems cover only two aspects. We have the very few with Lion and Eros with erotic magic. And then we have the zodiacal ring and the lion with the protome linked with seasonal renewal. But other signs are not so used in magical practices. In fact, also on the corpus of astrological gems that are 770, the magical ones are very few compared to the rest of the corpus. But even for the zodiacal sign themselves, because for example, we have very few Aquarius, very few Sagittarius. And this is also linked with the symbolic value of the sign. I mean, we have a lot of Capricornus just because of Augustus, but basically Capricornus is a negative sign. If you look at prediction, it's just the fact that Octavian manipulated and rendering for in his political propaganda that explodes the number. But Pisces are very few, Sagittarius are very few, because there are not so from a symbolic point of view important. And this is also interesting because that means that birth using, representing his own birth signs doesn't seem to be very frequent, because we would also expect to have more, for example, of other signs, for example, of more Sagittarius, that we have only 3 occasions. So always based on the symbolic value of the zodiacal sign itself, and especially for the fact that there are so few astrological gems that can have a magical meaning.
Oh, thank you. If I may,
Yes.
I have final question. It's closely related to the third one. We have very few, sorry, magical astrological gems. So the most of the magical, it's impossible to pronounce. The magical astrological gems are unique pieces and not belongs to series, which is one of the main characteristic of the magical gems.
Well, the one that I show are quite in the series, because lion with the...
So lion, okay, Cancer, okay, Scorpion.
Well,
okay.
Scorpion, it's difficult.
But the other ones, the other, so most of the other ones are not are rather unique piece, if I'm not mistaken. Or is it? It's
not the one that I choose, not the 200 one, because in there are the series of the 7 stars that are quite a lot. The series with Leo and the head of Taurus, the series with the zodiacal ring. The unique one are the one that are more linked with the decans. But normally they are at least a small series, because also Lion with Eros is just 10, but
that's okay.
But the other one, no, there are not so unique cases. Horoscopes can be considered as kind of unique, but there are 5 examples, so we cannot consider a huge series. But of course, if we compare with other magical gems, yes, but it is the case also on magical gems itself, that we have a little series and bigger one. But I have not so many in the 200s of unique. I didn't put them there, especially because it's a little bit, yeah.
Okay, so thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, Kevin.
On this one. Okay, nice. Wow, nice. Okay, thank you. I was just wondering if you had investigated the power of the stone itself, because we see that we could have one sign on 2 different type of stone. Okay, of 2 different type of stone. Does it work well? Oh, it's me. Okay.
Sorry, I don't think we're hearing you very well.
We'll summarize. You can summarize.
Yeah.
Or you can come up.
Yeah. Why don't you come here? Come here. It's fine.
Just because we have but the same sign are 2 different stones. It was not the same of the stone. And then I was wondering if the stone itself had its own power,
And it could be linked to the color of the sign itself, because for instance, Aries is fire, and if you put it on, I don't know, amethyst, amethyst is water, so it's really large, or you have this kind of.
Thank you.
So the question related to the connection, possible connection between the iconographic forms of the images engraved on a gem and the powers, the intrinsic properties of the material.
We have some case, but it's not systematic, as I show, for example, for Jasper, Cancer, and Jupiter. But it's not systematic if we compare with what we know of the aniconic stones and their use on some medical practices and the link with precise planets. Because this systematic use of a particular stone that is important because it's linked with a particular planet is more present on the use of the stone itself without an image on some practice. If I can give you an example, for example, Gagates, it's this kind of it's an organic stone, and it is linked with Kronos because it's black. The planet is black, and it's used, for example, in fumigation for revealing epilepsy. Why? Just simply because it's black as the planet, and Saturn in planetary Menothesia is the one that is linked with the nervous system. So it's more systematic in the literal practices, but not so much on the engraved gemstones. And normally, there are not like the property of stones that are used are more linked with the planet. We don't have like the sign of air linked with particular material, because the important things was more the planet itself than the zodiacal sign.
Okay, so I could use whatever I want, like I could use whatever the stone that I want for making the carve of the sign. I could use whatever the stone I want, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically are the stone that are always used for engraving gemstones, like a red jasper, green jasper, but you don't need to use a specific one to engrave. There is the case of the lion, but there is another symbolism, because lion appear mostly on yellow jasper, because in the lapidaries, yellow jasper is considered to be linked with the skin of the lion itself that can heal against scorpion stings. But here it's not linked with planets, it's just something that it's considered in the lapidaries. And then you can find a lot of lion engraved on yellow jasper. Or is the same with, it's more systematic, maybe with magical gems, but they're also on specific series. For example, hematite with the uterus for healing female problems, but there also there is not the influence of planets. It's just the power of the stone itself that when it's broken became became red. So it's linked with blood. It's problematic. Anyway, colors play an important role in the when you choose the stone, but the color that it's chosen is not linked with some astrological claims. It's mostly in, for example, green. It's so often linked with problem with the stomach, so you can find a lot of knumis engraved on green stones. But this is also debatable. It's not and it's not sure at all too. But anyway, it's more concrete for aniconic stone. Like galactite, for example, is linked with milk, production of milk for females. So.
Thank you, Kevin. Alexander von Leven, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much.
just a very short and probably very stupid question on several of these gems showing areas. They have the caduceus of Mercury. Not on all, if I saw it correctly, but on several. So why is that? Is there some mythological reason, or does it have anything to do with the position of the planet Mercury, or what is the reason for that?
Thank you very much for the question. It is an interesting question because the caduceus also appear for a mythological reason, also on non-astrological gemstones, with the normal representation of the ram. But in the case of astrological gemstones, Mercury is, now I don't have in mind the link that he have with the constellation of Aries, sorry, I don't recall if it is the exaltation or there is some dignities that explain the presence of the caduceus linked with the zodiacal sign.
Thank you.
Joachim Prack, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And since you asked me specifically about my opinion concerning the possible case of the headless one, I have not yet made up my head, but at least I still have it. It's a tricky question, which of course involves very much how you interpret some other gems like Bibliothèque Nationale 2170, where I rather doubt that they really belong to the tradition of the headless god. I think this might be something which developed out of the iconography of base, but I suppose it's a bit too complicated to discuss fully here online.
Yes, no, thank you very much for your intakes on this particular gem, that it's still quite enigmatic. Thank you.
And you said that you're pretty convinced it's post-antique.
Yes, also it was in the first exchange with Arpad because he have an autoptic view of the piece. And but also this shape of this as a little house, I didn't have time yet to find if there are other parallels of this kind of schematic representation, even outside of astrological gemstones. But I didn't still yet find, but I think that we can find some parallel of this particular shape, but inscribed with astrological motif for the moment is still an unicum, so I don't have. And it's also strange that on the outer rim, they stop at a moment to engrave the zodiacal signs. So they just put 3.
Yeah.
And there is no continuation on the series. This, I don't know, it can also be later engraved when the gem was reused for some motive, but I don't have an explanation at all on the rest of this interesting piece that for the moment still remain an enigma.
Thank you, Fabio. That was great. Yeah, right. Next.